I'm here with Greg Lookerse, who's an art prof at Hope College, and maybe you can just say a little bit about who you are, and then we can jump in.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, by the way.
Yeah.
This is exciting. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, which means I don't know, couldn't find a singular medium to, to pigeonhole me is how I would say it. So I work in a bunch of different fields, and then I teach art and design over at Hope College. I'm very much interested in the intersections of art and faith. I think that there's a natural connection there. Even the other day I was in a meeting about the Abbey Retreat and heard some of the difficulties that the Abbey Retreat is trying to deal with in the seminary students. And I was like, oh, that's what we talked about in grad school for artists.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, I think of art as a vocation, not necessarily like a job. Which I think probably most of your students, I hope most of your students think of what they're doing in that way as well.
Yeah, we do talk a lot about vocation and vocational discernment here. I love that, that you think a lot about art and faith, and I'm wondering if we could start just by exploring generally, when you think about the relationship between art and faith, or even more specifically, the relationship between art or creativity and scripture, and art and creativity being an approach to and a way of interpreting scripture, what sort of stands out as really important to you?
One of the main things, I'll probably either reference or maybe read a quote from this book I have over here by George Saunders called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. But basically, most people have this sense that art is about communicating a message. And it's not that art isn't about that, but that is oftentimes one of the most basic aspects of art. As in, most Christians are at least somewhat aware of Rembrandt's painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son. The communication would be something along the lines of like telling accurately the story of how that parable ends. That the prodigal son returns, the father is embracing him, the eldest son who did not leave and take his inheritance standing off to the side, and that's it. But if anyone has read, who's it, Henry Nouwen? Henry Nouwen. If anyone's read that book, it's like you understand that there is so much more happening in there. And so this notion that art is simply like, we're doing this to communicate a message, I actually think it's rarely that. So like I think Saunders, here I'll show the cover of the book. It's a beautiful book. Everyone should read this. The book itself is, he's got 7 Russian short stories that he reads with his MFA students at the Syracuse program, and he has several essays that are just responding to them. Why do these things work? And he doesn't use things like, because the story taught a good lesson. It's very different than that. But so in one of his afterthoughts, he has, I think, a very good description of what I mean, and I'll try to tie this to your question of reading the Bible. He says, we often discuss art this way. The artist had something he wanted to express, and then he just, expressed it. That is, we buy into some version of the intentional fallacy, that the notion that art is about having a clear-cut intention and then confidently executing the same. Says the actual process, in my experience, is much more mysterious and beautiful and more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully. So then he tells, I've been calling this the parable of Stan. So then he tells a story to try to get at the fact that that's really hard to explain. It seems like that. You might look at me and think like, well, that work you have out there, like you thought it up. It's like, not really, kind of. I had an intuition that like drove me towards something, and there's a bunch of changes along the way. So he says, a guy, Stan, constructs a model railroad town in his basement. Stan acquires a small hobo, places him under a plastic railroad bridge near the fake campfire, then notices that he's arranged his hobo in a certain posture. The hobo seems to be gazing back at the town. Why is he looking over there? At that little blue Victorian house. Stan notes a plastic woman in the window, then turns her a little, so she's gazing out. Over at the railroad bridge, actually. Suddenly, Stan has made a love story. Oh, why can't they be together? If only little Jack would just go home to see his wife, to Linda. What did Stan, the artist, just do? Well, first, surveying his little domain, he noticed which way his hobo was looking. And noticed is italicized. Then he chose to change that little universe by turning the plastic woman. Now, Stan didn't exactly decide to turn her. It might be more accurate to say that it occurred to him to do so in a split second, with no accompanying language, except maybe a very quiet internal yes. He just liked it better that way, for reasons he couldn't articulate, and before he'd had the time or inclination to articulate them. In my view, all art begins in that instant of intuitive preference. Like, that sense of it's a discovery.
Yeah.
And that, like, who knows what Stan set out to do when he's making his model railroad, but that sense of noticing and making a change, I see that in the sense of that. I think that most exegesis or interpretation that I enjoy, I think, is coming from that. As in, a person doesn't set out and say, I want to define, how God is the foundation of the transcendent beauty. Mm-hmm. And then they figure out how do they do that. Mm-hmm. I think that's frequently it is the most stilted and disingenuous. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that most often it's more like a person should be encountering the Bible and like questions arise. Like for me in my work, one of the questions that arose is like, this has been like a lifelong pursuant in my work is I can't imagine an existence without suffering. And so then when I hear about the new creation and the new earth, which that piece is kind of about that, I'm pointing to the atrium in case people don't know.
This is a distance learning class, so y'all will see it when you come for the intensive in the Abbey retreat.
Yeah. So it's like I don't understand how, like I don't have the imagination to imagine being able to exist without pains in my back, without frustrations, without being able to achieve things. And so when I read about the new creation and the new heavens and the new earth, it doesn't make sense. Like I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And it's like starting from that question and then approaching the text and being like open and trying to notice things and seeing connections. And obviously I think it's a little bit different in, I don't think we're supposed to change the text like he changes the woman, but I do think that it's a similar process of probably noticing the changes in you. Yeah. Even though I don't understand that cognitively, the more I've just lived into my faith and sort of approached the world as like, well, it's this mystery I don't get. Mm-hmm. Suddenly I start noticing changes in me. And then I read, The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis and the description of Aslan's country, and it reminds me of things, and I start getting goosebumps even now. Yeah. And I think, I don't know what it means, but there's a connection there. Yeah. And like that kind of, we haven't said the word yet, but that kind of surprise of like how you're approaching it. So I think that, I'm not saying that there's not a place for that kind of more definitive way of approaching the text, but I do think that, especially right now, that this kind of creative interaction, one of noticing and then trying to make connections that you weren't planned, but allowing them to unfold as you discover them, I think that's what C.S. Lewis was doing a lot of. And I know most people wouldn't want me to say he's a theologian, but he makes theological claims.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the two things I hear in that really are striking to me and feel important is the noticing, the posture of paying careful attention. That seems to have a lot of crossover between artists who, one of the ways that I view the vocation of art is the practice of paying attention to the world, to your own intuitions, right? And then also paying attention to the details then of the text. Yeah. Thinking about scripture. And then that paying attention, that noticing, leads to new discoveries. Yeah. And so I want to share a quote with you and get your feedback on this. So my wife is an artist, a visual artist, and so I've come to a deeper appreciation and love of visual art through her work. I have zero visual artistic capacity. My stick figures don't even really look like stick figures. But I love poetry, and I'm really drawn to poets. And so one of the poets I was reading recently, Carl Phillips, who won the Pulitzer Prize several years ago, he talks about he's specifically talking about writing, but what he's saying applies to, I think, all kinds of creative expression, both the act of expressing creativity, but also receiving other people's expressions of creativity, like we have in the scriptures. So he says this: "For me, both as a reader and a writer, a piece of writing," but again, the same for all art, "is only as interesting as its capacity for surprise. And it's the possibility of surprise, the firm belief in that possibility, that keeps me reading and writing." And I love this quote because I love how he frames this, like the expectation that he brings to any sort of engagement with art.
Yeah.
Is that he expects to find some kind of surprise and make a discovery. He brings his attention and he receives the gift of surprise. And surprise could be maybe associated with learning, experiencing something new. And so I'm thinking for my students who maybe don't consider themselves artists, or even maybe very creative, when you think about this idea of one end goal being surprise, and sort of connecting that with this idea of paying attention, what do you hear in that, and what kind of invitation does that do you hear in that for a student maybe who is like, I don't feel like I'm very creative. What can I do?
Yeah, it's hard because you can't. It's very difficult to approach intentionally, like, I'm going to go to this place and be surprised.
Yeah.
It's like plan for the unexpected.
Yeah.
Like to some degree it sounds contradictory, I think. But I think you can think of it maybe to better, in my opinion, to kind of elucidate what he's getting at, is to think about it like frequently when Christians are interacting with art, the surprise is the negative part. They look at a work of art and they're like, okay, I've got a list of things that Christian art is supposed to do. It must, and they're not bad things necessarily. It's like it must affirm Christ as Lord. It must, display a Trinitarian mindset. It must, sometimes it's really like rigid. Like it has to be symmetrical. It has to be, high quality materials. It has to be all these things. And so then they're approaching it and they're saying, literally, like, if it does something else, which would be the surprising thing, probably, it's like, that's bad. It didn't align with what I thought. And then I just think about, like, how many times in the Bible is that kind of approach, the Pharisaical approach, so to speak. God is constantly trying to get us to wake up. And yes, there are structures and rules that are applied. I'm not saying let go of all the rules and just, have a postmodern heyday. I mean, like, so often, even like the reading the text of, like, say, the New Testament, reading a gospel, you have this film of familiarity where it's like you have a sense as you think you know what it's about. But every time, in order to be humble, you have to come forward to it as if you don't know what it's about, that you might be surprised. And that's where it's like, can you start writing a sentence without knowing where you're going? Yeah. Can you do that with a couple of things? Can you start building your realm of your train set? And oftentimes, to me, the best way for me to get there is to ask questions. Rather than saying, this is the answer I want to get to. I want to make a work of art that is going to make all of the Western Theological Seminary people just be like, oh my God, he's a genius. Like, I can't do that.
Right.
If I try that, like, I'm going to fail.
Yeah.
If I try this massive thing, instead I can ask a question. I can be like, how do I get at this notion of ascending into the heavens? I'm thinking about the office spaces around here, and I think all of you guys are somehow trying to draw closer to the good, the true, the beautiful. And yet, it seems like, you yourself, every day you climb the stairs, and then if you're going to go home, you got to go back down.
Yeah.
And I think about that all the time. Moses goes up the mountain, he comes down. Yeah. Jacob's ladder is ascending and descending. And so, that's where the piece starts. Like, the question is, how do I get at that? It's like, something needs to ascend and it needs to descend. What ascends and descends? A scroll. It's like, if I have a scroll rotating, one side's going up, one side's going down.
Yeah.
And it's like that leads So I am getting surprised thinking, okay, so if I've got a scroll hanging in this space, like where does that lead me? And that's to me, that's like the real writing of like, say, I'm assuming they all have to do like theses or dissertations or statements like that of some sort. It's like, don't start with where you want to end.
Yeah.
Start with the question that gets you on a path. Why is James such a weird book? I don't, what do you mean? Like this whole faith and action thing. What's going on here? Should I be a Catholic? Should I be a Protestant? Like start with those questions and see where the questions lead you, and let yourself be surprised. And then it'll like, and the same thing as you approach a work of art. This is like, C.S. Lewis has a great quote in his On Criticism. I think it's a book called On Criticism, where he basically says you can't know what a work of art is until you open yourself up to it. You have to risk it being offensive and bad. You have to just it's the same with a book. Every time you pick up a book, you have to give yourself to it before you judge it.
Yeah.
And so the same is with a work of art. You might have that checklist, but like get rid of that checklist in your mind and open yourself up and imagine, give it some faith, and your heart will be broken. You'll look at some works of art and they'll offend, they'll be, evil and horrible and filled with artist narcissism. That's going to happen. But you have to risk that in order to see the surprise, in order to discover more. You have to risk that kind of you have to risk the letdown to find, that gem.
Yeah. I love when you talked about not starting with like where you're going to end or an agenda, but starting with the questions and letting the questions kind of guide that discovery process. And I'm thinking about the project that the students are going to be working on, which will be related to the role of violence in the stories of Kings and Samuel and Kings. And so there's all kinds of visceral, real questions that the just sort of general presence of violence in the text raises, but also the sort of specific questions that a particular passage might raise. And just offering that to the students as you are approaching interpreting your text through a creative medium, to allow the questions to rise and to attend to them, to sit with them, and to listen to the questions. And the other thing that you said was, you can't sit down and try to make a piece of art that's going to make everyone think you're a brilliant artist, right? Because then you're going to fail. But if you sit down and you actually attend faithfully to the process, you might come up with something that's your most creative work that might then have that result or might not have that result.
Well, and if you start with questions, often it's like you have a question. Well, you're a human being just like the rest of us. Probably it's a question we all like. Like as in we'll be interested in that. We might not be interested in your answer, but the question is always kind of interesting. Like to me, the other thing I do as an artist, and this is maybe just my own masochism to some degree, is like when I hear that as one of the things you guys are wrestling with, I'm like, ask the worst question you can imagine. What if the violence is good? Like I hope it's not, but what if it is? And then it's like, my God, where is that going to take you? How do you wrestle with that? Like, what does that mean about your whole entire foundation of your faith? And that's where I, when I think about my work, that's constantly, when people talk about imposter syndrome, there's some degree of what if I am doing is, foolish? You have those questions over and over. But I think when they're directed at something like that, first of all, I think the Bible can withstand most of our questions. We're pretty bad at questions, so it's pretty good at answers. And even though we don't pick up on the answers, but that's where those kinds of hard questions that you don't know the answer to. Don't ask questions that you know the answer to. You're actually just kind of playing at it. There's a poet who said, I think it was Michael Longley. It's one of the Irish poets who's alive right now, and he did this in a podcast with Krista Tippett, where he said he's so good at poetry that at any moment he can sit down and forge a poem. He can write something that other people will think is a poem, but he knows it's not, because he knows that it started from a place that he already knew where it was going to end.
Interesting.
that kind of thing.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
he's saying like it's only a poem if I start it from a place of surprise, you know, or openness to surprise. If I start writing without knowing where it's going, and he's like, and that's the hard, arduous process that is a pain in the butt. Uh-oh.
Hopefully that's
I would say usually it still continues recording.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that there's some like gentle guidance maybe for a student who doesn't feel like they might not naturally be inclined to sit down and try and express themselves in some sort of creative medium, a poem, a song, some visual art, you know, cross stitch or whatever it might be, making a quilt or something, sculpture.
I'm sorry, it was just funny to me that
cross stitch.
No, the notion that writing is not we're writing philosophical texts.
Like, it's not creative, right?
Right, you didn't create that at all. Those words just came out of, you know.
Exactly. But something that's like distinctly different from a research paper.
Yeah.
And that kind of forces you from that left brain dominance of organization and reason and research and control to this sort of open-ended space of mystery and curiosity and questions and more kind of creative, flexible expression. And what you were describing reminded me of a quote that a beloved poet friend of mine often gives when she's talking to lay people. I don't know if that term applies to like poets, non-poets, people who aren't professional poets. Teaching them how to write poetry she says, when you sit down, like you were saying, don't know where you're going to go. Whether you're going to write I'm thinking my students now, whether you're going to write a poem, a song, paint something, don't have a vision of what it's supposed to be. And then she says, it doesn't have to be good. It only has to be true. The next word that you write, the next line that you draw, the next sort of pressure you apply to the clay, whatever you're doing, it doesn't have to be right or good. It doesn't have to be your best work. It doesn't have to be the work that's going to make everyone think that you're brilliant. It just has to be true.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you hear in that, and if you resonate with that advice, and if you would have any similar or other advice for students.
That's really great advice. It's very similar to what Saunders would say in this book. One of the things he gets at when he says like the role of the writer is to get you to read the next word. And then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And sometimes you might hear that and say, oh, that's like populism. That's like write what people want to read. And it's not that. Yeah. Because what he's saying is like, I mean, just think about how many sermons have you heard that at the very beginning you hear it and you're like, yep, this is what I believe. And I know, like, kind of, you know, like maybe your students, the only reason you listen is to make sure he kind of like follows the same bullet points you would follow. But it's like you don't have to listen to that, you know? So it's not give them what they want. Rather, it's write in a way that your reader is willing, like they can just close the book. You know, they can just be like, screw this and move on. It's like write in a way that they want to know what the next word is going to be. And I think that is similar in that it's like, if you're reading it and it rings false, we see this all the time with television shows, especially situational comedies that are just trying to pump money, you know, keep it going and get money. So frequently people get disenchanted when the characters start doing things that are wrong, as in wrong to their character. You know, that's why everyone hated the ending of Game of Thrones, is because he sets up a world in which there's no good that can ever prevail, and then, spoiler alert, the answer is we need an all-knowing God to rule us. And it's like your universe doesn't have that. Like you set up a universe that doesn't allow that, and you're breaking the rules. And it got like everyone like is angry. Literally, he's rewriting the book so it doesn't. You know, like he saw that whatever his name is, Martin. And so it's like that's I think the same thing is like, you know, and you learn to get better at this. You know, you can't just start off like, oh, I heard this sentence, like make it true, and then I know it's like it's not necessarily true in the factual sense. You know, if I'm writing a poem about, you know, waterfalls, like what do you mean true? So the waterfall was there. I saw it.
The water fell from higher to lower.
Right. It's like, no, but, can you say, like, why do I look at waterfalls? Then start answering that question. They're beautiful. Why are they beautiful? It's like that is a series of true statements that in answering those questions, you'll get a sense of, like, other people will agree. Mm-hmm. They'll say, like, yeah, that is why I look at them as well. Mm-hmm.
Or they'll be like, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. Yeah, I have had that experience. Or, wow, I really want to go to a waterfall now because I never... Right.
Just don't go chasing them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, it kind of, that, in a sense, comes back to what we were talking about earlier about surprise. That if you're willing to not have a predetermined outcome and just follow the questions into the text and write the next true word or draw the next true line, you will be surprised at where it goes. Yeah. And if you're surprised at where it goes and you're learning along the way, then your reader or whoever's engaging whatever you create might also then be surprised by it as well.
Yeah. You know what this all reminds me of?
What's that?
Being a faithful Christian. Yeah. That's my whole thing. My whole, what I hope to teach, maybe I'll write a book about this one day, is when you're in practicing the creative practice, it is practice for being a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's very hard in our day and age, especially in Protestant culture that doesn't have very many spiritual disciplines. And what I've found is through getting better at doing this, I become a more faithful Christian. Because it's like, oh, that's exactly, God doesn't tell you what most of us, he doesn't say, like, you're going to do this. It's like, he's like, take the next step. You're like, but I don't know where it's going. It's like, that's what I do in my studio every day that I'm in there working, is trusting, waiting, noticing, changing things that are within my control to the things, to the way I think would be best, noticing how I frequently get it wrong, and, apologizing and, sorry, paper, I ruined you.
Yeah.
Get a new sheet out.
Yeah. Yeah, art and creativity as acts of discipleship, right? Spiritual practices. I love that. Well, that connects to close us with another quote that I heard recently that I love by Brother David Steindl Rast, who I call the guru of gratitude. He started a network of grateful living, I think was the name of, it's a website and it's a whole community of gratitude. He's written a lot about this, and he talks about surprise. And he said that surprise is another name for God. And that, in fact, it's the only name for God that doesn't limit God, which I think is really interesting and profound. But what this suggests to me, in light of our conversation, is that when we engage the text creatively, when we let the questions guide us, we follow them into the unknown of the text, of our own hearts, our own experience, and we pay attention and notice things and then write whatever or draw whatever is true. When we experience that surprise, we encounter that surprise, what we're actually doing is encountering the living God. And that creativity, art, is in that sense a threshold. It's a doorway for us to enter into God's presence and encounter God and learn, be formed by, not just by the Spirit, but by the experience. And so I'm so grateful for your work and so grateful for this conversation, and I'm really excited to see what my students will come up with. Hopefully this has been encouraging and inspiring to them. Any last words?
I think the only, just to further my thoughts in response to that quote, is just imagine you die and you get to heaven, and somehow whatever occurs, you enter the throne room of God and you think, just like I thought. Like, really? Of course it's going to be surprising. You're gonna be like, it's nothing like I thought, and thank God it isn't.
Amen. That's great.